April 4, 1945, the Philippine Sea. The horizon trembles under the weight of heat and distance. High above the waves, a young Japanese pilot grips the control column of his Mitsubishi Zero. Below him lies a speck of gray steel moving across the endless blue, a British carrier. He's been told they burn the same as the Americans. That one good hit could send thousands of men to the bottom. But as he dives, the sea seems to rise to meet him, and the ship doesn't flinch. The anti-aircraft fire is not wild or panicked. It's measured, disciplined, like a living machine of light and thunder. His engine screams. A flash. Impact, smoke, flames. Then, impossibly, the carrier still floats. The deck crew are already clearing wreckage. Within an hour, aircraft rise again from a flight deck, scarred but unbroken. For the surviving Japanese pilots circling above, one truth spreads quietly through the static of their radios. The British carriers would not die like the others. Their fear had just begun. Long before the Pacific roared with fire, the future of naval warfare was being shaped in silent shipyards and treaty rooms. The year was 1922. The Washington Naval Treaty had just limited battleship construction, forcing the world's great powers to think differently. The Royal Navy, proud but strained by post-World War I exhaustion, turned its gaze to a new kind of capital ship, the aircraft carrier. To British designers, one lesson from the Great War stood out above all. Ships die by fire. Bombs, shells, or torpedoes didn't just pierce steel, they ignited it. Oil, ammunition, aircraft fuel, all turned a floating fortress into a funeral pyre. If carriers were to replace battleships, they had to survive the fire, not just outrun it. So the Royal Navy's architects made a radical choice. They built carriers like warships, not airfields. The flight deck, where American designers favored lightweight wooden planking over steel to maximize aircraft operations, was instead a thick, armored plate on British carriers. Beneath it, the hangar itself was enclosed in armor and subdivided by heavy bulkheads. These were not simply platforms for planes. They were citadels afloat. By contrast, across the Atlantic, American naval thinking was shaped by geography and ambition. The U.S. Navy anticipated vast offensive operations across open ocean, a war of reach and rhythm. They prioritized deck space, sortie rate, and aircraft capacity. Weight saved on armor meant more planes and faster launch cycles. Their carriers were, in essence, flying airfields, powerful, flexible, but comparatively fragile. When the Pacific War erupted in 1941, both philosophies would be tested in blood. For the Japanese Navy, aircraft carriers were sacred instruments of offensive might. Swift, elegant, and devastating. The Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm, the Kido Butai, delivered destruction with precision and pride. They had shattered Pearl Harbor, crippled the British at Singapore, and for a moment ruled the Pacific sky. Their pilots were trained not merely to strike, but to destroy utterly. Their understanding of carriers, both friend and foe, was simple. Hit the flight deck, and the ship dies. A single bomb or torpedo through thin wooden planking could cripple flight operations, ignite aviation fuel, and gut a carrier's heart. For years, this truth held. At Coral Sea, Midway, Santa Cruz, the carriers burned, Japanese and American alike, consumed by aviation gasoline and exploding munitions. Survival depended not on armor, but on luck, skill, and speed of repair. But in the faraway North Atlantic, the Royal Navy had already been fighting a different kind of war. British carriers such as Illustrious, Formidable, and Victorious faced the Luftwaffe's dive bombers and torpedo planes in the Mediterranean, a crucible of relentless air attack. Their armored decks were scarred again and again, but they survived where others might not. The Admiralty took note. The concept had worked. The carriers returned home battered, yet floating. Aircraft could be replaced. Steel could be welded. But ships that didn't sink, that was survival turned into strategy. So when the British Pacific Fleet was formed in late 1944, its core carriers carried that same philosophy. Indefatigable, formidable, victorious. Indomitable, armored behemoths ready to join the U.S. Navy's advance toward Okinawa. They were fewer in number but designed to endure. The Japanese airmen who would soon meet them in the skies had never faced ships like these. To them, every flat-topped silhouette had meant the same thing. A single hit, a burning inferno. They had seen it at Midway, in the Solomons, at Leyte Gulf. But the British carriers were something new. The Pacific would teach them a lesson forged in steel and in disbelief. And as the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War loomed, the skies over Okinawa would become their proving ground. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final, most desperate phase. Japan was cornered, its once mighty navy shattered, its air arm bled dry. Yet one weapon remained, the Tokotai, the Special Attack Corps. To the west, they would be called kamikaze. What began as a symbol of divine sacrifice soon became Japan's last military gamble. Thousands of young pilots, often with fewer than 100 flight hours, were told that their death would delay defeat, that to crash one aircraft into one ship was the highest form of service. When the British Pacific Fleet, BPF, arrived off Okinawa in March 1945, they entered a sky already thick with suicide planes. The Americans had been enduring kamikaze assaults for months. Their carriers, wooden-decked, wide, efficient, had suffered grievous damage. The Franklin, Bunker Hill, Intrepid, Ticonderoga, all had burned, hundreds of sailors lost, flight operations crippled for weeks. But the Royal Navy's fleet, codenamed Task Force 57, was a different breed. Under Vice Admiral Sir Philip Vian, its carriers operated alongside the U.S. Fifth Fleet under Admiral Raymond Spruance. Their mission: neutralize Japanese airfields in the Sakishima Gunto Islands, those same strips from which kamikazes would rise to strike the American invasion armada at Okinawa. To do so, the British had to sail directly into the kamikazes' hunting ground. On paper, they were outmatched. The British carried fewer aircraft per ship, had shorter decks, and depended on American logistics for everything from fuel to food. But what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in resilience. Their ships were built for survival in tight seas and relentless bombardment. Lessons drawn from Malta, Crete, and the Mediterranean's narrow, lethal skies. Each British carrier's heart was its armored flight deck, 3 inches of hardened steel protecting the hangar below. Beneath that, fuel lines were encased, ordnance storage isolated, and firefighting systems pressurized and redundant. British doctrine treated aviation gasoline as a potential explosive, not a convenience. Fuel tanks were drained, purged, and refilled for every sortie. Every movement on deck was disciplined, controlled chaos tamed by drill. And below decks, design mirrored psychology. Where American carriers had spacious hangars open to the sea breeze, British carriers had enclosed hangars armored like fortresses. Their aircraft elevators were smaller, their repair crews more compact, but their defenses tighter. The trade-off was clear: fewer planes, slower rearming, but far greater survivability. To Japanese pilots, however, this difference was invisible until it was too late. A carrier was a carrier, until it refused to die. Radar control gave the British an early advantage. The Royal Navy had refined radar-directed fighter interception during years of combat over the Atlantic. Fighter direction officers aboard radar picket ships and carriers could vector corsairs and Hellcats precisely to intercept incoming raids, reducing the chaos of defense to a grim calculation of bearing, altitude, and closure speed. When the kamikazes came, single zeros, Oscars, Vals, Judys, they found not the chaos they had hoped for, but a wall of fire. British ships layered their anti-aircraft defense like a fortress at sea. Long-range 4.5-inch dual-purpose guns created high-altitude barrages. At closer range, the 40mm Bofors filled the air with converging tracers, while the rapid-firing 20mm Oerlikons stitched the sky with steel. Each carrier was ringed by destroyers, cruisers, and radar pickets, forming a lethal envelope that tightened as the attackers dove. Still, some kamikazes got through. The Japanese airmen quickly realized that British carriers absorbed punishment differently. Their bombs cratered the decks but did not ignite them. Where American decks erupted into fireballs, British ones sparked, smoldered, then cleared. Crews, protected by internal armor, fought fires fast, sealed compartments, and resumed launches sometimes within an hour. Reports from Japanese reconnaissance began filtering back. Enemy carriers resist burning. Decks appear of steel. Multiple hits. No sinking observed. In the minds of pilots trained to die for decisive effect, that changed everything. The fear that began as confusion soon turned into dread. A kamikaze's power lay in the certainty of destruction, of taking the enemy with him. But against these carriers, the sacrifice achieved almost nothing. And as April deepened into May, the Japanese would discover the truth firsthand, in the brutal burning skies above Okinawa. Angle A. Armor and architecture. At the heart of British carrier design was a single defiant principle: survival before sortie rate. The Royal Navy had learned the cost of vulnerability the hard way. In the Mediterranean, where dive bombers ruled the air, and every mission risked annihilation. When they built the illustrious class carriers, they treated the flight deck not as a working surface, but as a shield. The result was a vessel more fortress than airfield. Their 3-inch armored flight decks were designed to shrug off 500-pound bombs, the kind that could rip open wooden American decks. Beneath that steel layer sat armored hangars, compartmentalized and reinforced to prevent fires from spreading. Damage that would have gutted an Essex-class carrier might leave a British one merely bruised. Of course, this protection came at a price. The heavy decks reduced aircraft capacity, 45 planes instead of America's 90 or more. Launch and recovery rates were slower, but when the kamikazes came, those trade-offs saved hundreds of lives. At Okinawa, the Formidable was hit by a 500-kilo bomb carried by a kamikaze on May 4, 1945. The explosion tore a hole in the deck, killing 8 and wounding 47. But within an hour, the ship resumed launching aircraft. In U.S. action reports, comparable hits rendered carriers inoperable for days or weeks. Japanese pilots, trained to believe that one hit equaled one kill, found themselves staring at ships that refused to die. The armor didn't just stop steel, it stopped the logic of suicide warfare. Angle B. Damage control. Culture technology alone didn't make British carriers terrifying. It was the human machine that lived inside them. The Royal Navy's doctrine of damage control was shaped by decades of North Atlantic seamanship, where cold water and isolation demanded discipline. Crews drilled constantly for impact, fire, and flood. When a kamikaze struck, there was no chaos, only procedure. Fire curtains dropped, compartments sealed, fire mains pressurized. In many accounts, sailors were already manning hoses before the aircraft hit. On Indefatigable, struck by a kamikaze on April 1, 1945, the damage control teams had extinguished flames within 15 minutes. The ship resumed flight operations the same afternoon. Her crew lost 14 men. Tragic, but operationally insignificant. In contrast, American carriers, though equally brave, fought fires in open hangars where aviation gasoline lines and parked planes formed a deadly chain of fuel and flame. The U.S. Navy would later adopt improved firefighting systems and deck armor, lessons written in the blood of Franklin and Bunker Hill. To the kamikaze pilots, this discipline was incomprehensible. They expected chaos. They found precision. They expected flames. They saw steam. The Royal Navy didn't just survive attacks. It absorbed them, turned damage into ritual, disaster into rhythm. Each successful defense was a psychological strike, back against the myth of invincibility that Japanese propaganda had promised its pilots. Angle C. Fighter direction and radar by 1945. The war in the air had become a contest not just of pilots, but of mathematics. The Royal Navy's edge lay in its mastery of radar-directed interception. Every major British carrier group operated with a fighter direction ship, often a cruiser or dedicated radar platform fitted with the latest Type 277 or 293 sets. These systems could detect incoming aircraft at 80 to 100 miles, giving fighter controllers precious minutes to vector their combat air patrols. It wasn't the raw technology that frightened Japanese pilots. It was what it did to their timing. Kamikaze attacks depended on surprise and swarm. The moment radar broke that rhythm, coordination collapsed. British Corsairs and Hellcats were guided into precise intercept patterns. Voice transmissions were calm, methodical. Angels 5, Vector 080, Bandits inbound. Each interception chipped away at the kamikaze waves before they could form. American forces had similar radar capabilities, but the Royal Navy's smaller formations allowed for more concentrated coordination, a tighter, almost personal defense network. For the attackers, the result was unnerving. The ocean below was invisible beneath the flak bursts, and long before they reached visual range, half their comrades were already falling. Survivors who pressed through the wall of anti-aircraft fire often met an enemy they couldn't see. Radar had stripped away surprise, the last weapon of the kamikaze. British carriers thus stood as more than targets. They were traps, floating beacons of calm amid chaos, ringed with invisible defenses and unflinching men. And for those who lived to report what they'd seen, there was only one way to describe it. Their ships fight like iron. The armored decks, the disciplined damage control, the unseen eye of radar. These formed the foundation of the fear. But fear, like warfare, has layers. To understand how deeply it ran, we must look beyond steel and systems, to the air itself, and to the men who flew toward death. Angle D, anti-aircraft density and layering. The first thing a Japanese pilot noticed when approaching a British carrier group was not the ships. It was the air itself. It shimmered, flickered, and then exploded into light. British and Commonwealth gunners had refined the art of anti-aircraft defense into something closer to choreography. The big 4.5-inch dual-purpose guns thundered first, their shells bursting in great black puffs miles above the fleet. Closer in, the steady bark of 40mm Bofors cannons took over, each gun directed by radar or predictor sights, firing in tightly controlled arcs. Then came the chattering 20-meter Oerlikons, spraying streams of tracer across the final 100 yards of sky. The Royal Navy called it the umbrella, a layered defense that no pilot could pass through untouched. To the kamikazes, whose attacks relied on nerves and momentum, that umbrella felt like a storm of solid fire. Those who survived the first barrage dove lower, into the chaos of tracer webs and smoke, only to find destroyers and cruisers adding their own guns to the inferno. Observers aboard Indomitable described the sky as boiling with steel. One British report noted that Japanese aircraft often broke formation before reaching the carriers, not from mechanical failure, but from sheer disorientation under fire. In one recorded case, a kamikaze aimed at Formidable veered off at the last second, crashing into the sea without ever being hit. Fear is not always born of wounds. Sometimes it comes from knowing a single mistake means obliteration before glory. The density of British AA fire, smaller groups, tighter formations, disciplined coordination, magnified that fear. Against such defense, even the divine wind faltered. Angle E, the Japanese pilot's experience, late war reality. By 1945, Japan's airmen were fighting ghosts. The veteran aviators of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea were gone. Replacements, often 18 or 19 years old, were hastily trained, barely able to land or navigate by instrument. Many learned only the most essential maneuvers: takeoff, climb, and dive. Their missions were one way by design, but their fear was still human. They flew aircraft stripped of armor, sometimes loaded with little more than a single 500-kilo bomb, and the fuel to reach the target. Radios were unreliable. Interceptors tore into them long before they reached visual range, and when the ocean revealed its steel prey, the young pilots faced something unimaginable: ships that refused to die. The reports that trickled back to surviving commanders were confused, almost despairing. Attack achieved. No explosion, enemy deck armored. Aircraft destroyed before impact. Others ineffective. In Japanese military culture, failure was not just defeat. It was dishonor. To strike without sinking the enemy was to die without meaning. Soon, British carriers developed a reputation even among the desperate. Pilots began to prefer attacking American ships. Larger, with wooden decks that promised visible destruction. British carriers, meanwhile, became known as Teko no Kokubokan, the armored carriers. The terror was not mystical. It was logical. When death is certain and success uncertain, fear grows faster than courage. Angle F. Continuity of operations. In modern war, symbolism is as powerful as steel, and the British Pacific Fleet understood that every takeoff, every landing after an attack, was a message to both friend and foe. We are still here. Where an American carrier might take days to repair a bombed flight deck, British carriers often resumed operations within hours. After Formidable was struck by a kamikaze on May 9th, her deck teams had filled the crater with quick-setting concrete and resumed launches by mid-afternoon. On Indefatigable, hit twice in the same week, the flag still flew. The planes still rose. From the Japanese perspective, this was not supposed to happen. Their sacrifice, their single divine blow, was meant to change the tide of battle. Instead, it barely slowed the enemy. Every time a British carrier relaunched aircraft from a damaged deck, it shattered the myth of the kamikaze's inevitability. Each sortie after impact was a victory of will over despair. Even American observers aboard nearby ships took notice. Admiral Spruance later remarked that the British ships were incredibly tough, unshaken by punishment that would have crippled ours. To Japanese pilots who had been told their enemies were decadent, weak, and afraid of death, such endurance was incomprehensible. It turned the logic of the kamikaze inside out. If the enemy could not be destroyed, then the sacrifice was in vain. If the British could still fly, then the gods had turned away. By the time May 1945 bled into June, the Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm was nearly gone. What remained were fragments, young men, old planes, and fading hope. And as the final great carrier strikes of Okinawa raged, one truth was already taking hold. Fear had crossed the ocean, not in bombs, but in disbelief. The climax of that fear was about to play out, in a series of kamikaze strikes that would test British engineering, discipline, and resolve to their breaking point. April 1945. The skies above Okinawa were no longer blue. They were gray, choked with oil smoke and the contrails of death. Every morning began with the same sound, the drone of engines rising from the Ryukyu Islands. Each one could be a kamikaze. Each one could end a ship. The British Pacific Fleet, Task Force 57, took station west of Okinawa. 4 armored carriers, Indomitable, Indefatigable, Formidable, and Victorious, formed the backbone of the Royal Navy's striking arm. Their task was simple but brutal: suppress Japanese airfields at the Sakishima Gunto, denying kamikazes the ability to launch. It was a mission that meant absorbing the very attacks they sought to prevent. At dawn on April 1st, the first wave came. Radar picked up faint blips, a formation of Zeros inbound at low altitude, weaving between clouds. Fighter direction officers aboard Indomitable calmly vectored Corsairs from 1834 and 1836 squadrons to intercept. The Japanese lost 3 planes before even sighting the fleet, but one slipped through. A single kamikaze plunged from the overcast and slammed into Indefatigable's flight deck, just aft of the island. The explosion ripped through parked aircraft, throwing flaming debris into the sea. 14 men were killed. Yet within 30 minutes, the flight deck was cleared, patched, and launching planes again. To the men watching from other ships, it was unreal. The deck was smoking, scarred, but operational. The fleet didn't even slow. Over the following days, the attacks multiplied. April 4th, 6th, 9th. Wave after wave of kamikazes came screaming down from the clouds. The Japanese had expected the Americans. Instead, they found the British. When a kamikaze struck Formidable on May 4th, it carried a 500-kilo bomb beneath its fuselage. The aircraft hit the armored deck at a shallow angle, detonating directly over the hangar. The explosion tore a hole 20 feet wide, hurling men and aircraft across the deck. For minutes, smoke engulfed the ship. Fire parties charged through the flames in respirators, hoses slashing arcs of steam through the black haze. In the engine room, the vibration of impact was felt like a hammer blow, but the power never failed. Pumps roared, foam spread, and within an hour the smoke thinned. By 1700 hours, Formidable's deck was still cratered, but her flight operations had resumed. Avengers rolled forward, Corsairs lifted off, and the fleet's rhythm continued, as if defying death itself. American observers aboard nearby destroyers were stunned. One report noted, "British carrier Formidable received direct hit from suicide plane. Resumed operations within 1 hour. No further assistance required." The Japanese, monitoring the outcome from surviving bases, couldn't believe the intelligence reports. They had watched their pilots dive, seen the explosions through binoculars, yet reconnaissance flights showed the same carriers still. Launching strikes days later. Another attack came on May 9th. A Zero broke through cloud, cover, and dived straight onto Formidable again. The pilot's aim was perfect. The aircraft slammed into the same deck section as before. This time the armored plating flexed but did not break. The kamikaze's bomb exploded on the surface, scattering fragments but failing to penetrate. The pilot's sacrifice ended in smoke and sparks. The ship lived. To the men below decks, the impact was a thunderclap followed by silence. Then came the same calm voices over the intercom. "Flight deck damaged. Fire parties proceed to stations." It was almost mechanical, not callous, but practiced. A lifetime of training condensed into instinct. The British fleet endured 7 direct kamikaze hits during the Okinawa campaign. None of their carriers sank. None were rendered inoperable for more than a few hours. In contrast, American carriers hit by similar attacks often lost hundreds of men. Their decks turned to burning wreckage. Their operations halted for days. This was not a failure of courage. It was a difference in philosophy, in steel and doctrine. The British had built their carriers to survive being hit. The Americans had built theirs to avoid being hit. For the kamikaze pilots, that difference was fatal to morale. Each attack demanded the ultimate sacrifice, but against the British, it yielded no glory. Intercepted Japanese communications reflected growing confusion. Enemy carriers hit. Still operating. Success uncertain. Armor prevents destruction. Fear spread faster than facts. Young pilots, already terrified of failure, began to believe that British carriers were immune to death. Cursed targets that defied divine intent. Even the Imperial Navy's intelligence officers struggled to explain it. Some hypothesized that the ships carried steel decks, but others dismissed it as Allied propaganda. They had no frame of reference, no concept that an entire class of carrier could be built like a battleship. By late May, the Japanese commanders at Kyushu faced a crisis of faith. Kamikaze effectiveness had dropped dramatically. Targets that did not burn were simply not worth dying for. But the storm wasn't over yet. The British Pacific Fleet would face its most punishing series of attacks in mid-May, a crucible of fire and steel that would prove, beyond any doubt, why the Japanese had come to fear them above all others. May 1945. The final fury of Okinawa. The sky above the British fleet was thick with haze and vengeance. Japan had thrown what remained of its air arm into one last offensive. Massed kamikaze waves from Kyushu and Formosa. To the young men climbing into their cockpits, the orders were simple: destroy the enemy carriers or die trying. But they didn't know they were flying toward the toughest fleet afloat. On May 9th, Formidable once again took the brunt. Radar picked up multiple inbound formations. Interceptors launched, guns manned, every man aboard standing by for the now familiar scream of incoming engines. Out of the cloud, a Zero broke through at treetop height, its bomb armed, its pilot silent. It dove straight for the flight deck. The explosion shook the ship from bow to stern. A section of the deck peeled upward like paper. Smoke roared from ruptured seams. Fire spread across parked aircraft, and yet, within an hour, Formidable's crew had done the unthinkable. They filled the crater with quick-setting concrete, dragged the wreckage overboard, and reopened a portion of the flight deck. The ship launched strikes that same afternoon. British discipline was not born of coldness. It was survival through ritual. Every man had a task, every minute was practiced. If panic was contagious, so was composure. Meanwhile, on Victorious, another kamikaze struck. The aircraft hit her deck, its bomb detonating prematurely, blowing a hole but failing to penetrate the hangar. Damage control isolated fires in minutes. Captain Michael Denny recorded in his log simply, "Hit by suicide aircraft. Damage contained, flying to resume shortly. No emotion, just the cadence of command." Across the fleet, the same pattern repeated. Indefatigable took a hit that would have crippled an American carrier. She was operational again within 45 minutes. Indomitable, struck by debris and near misses, never left formation. Observers from the U.S. Navy could scarcely believe it. One American signal officer later wrote, "They fight their ships as if made of iron. Even when struck, they remain unnervingly calm." The Japanese, too, took notice. After-action reports from surviving pilots began to reveal a grim realization. British carriers could not be destroyed by single attacks. The armor on their decks absorbed bombs, contained fires, and denied the glorious infernos that kamikaze pilots had been taught to envision. A captured Japanese pilot, interrogated after the war, recalled, "We were told American carriers burned easily. British ships," they said, "were smaller, slower. But they did not burn. We could not understand." He paused, then added quietly, "It was like attacking a mountain." To those who lived through it, the contrast between fleets was unmistakable. While American Essex-class carriers often took days or weeks to repair damage from suicide attacks, the British Pacific Fleet rarely withdrew. Task Force 57 maintained constant air operations from late March to late May 1945, losing only 98 men killed across all carrier groups, astonishingly low given the ferocity of the kamikaze onslaught. The armor had done its job. The philosophy had proven itself, but the impact ran deeper than steel and statistics. The psychological reversal was complete. The kamikaze, once Japan's symbol of unstoppable sacrifice, was now losing its terror. Instead of inspiring awe, the suicide planes were seen by Allied crews as doomed, tragic, and ultimately futile. To the Japanese pilots, that futility was unbearable. Many never reached their targets. Others died believing their sacrifice had failed. Even those who hit saw the British carriers endure. It was as though death itself had lost meaning. By the end of May, the attacks dwindled. The once mighty airfields at Miyako and Ishigaki were smoking ruins under constant British and American bombardment. Japanese fuel reserves were nearly gone. Pilots took off knowing they would not return, but now uncertain whether their deaths would matter. Aboard Formidable, Admiral Vian walked the deck, still pitted with scars from multiple hits. The armor plates bore twisted metal and fresh welds, but the ship remained operational. A correspondent later described the scene. She looked wounded, tired, yet defiant. Around her, men worked as if war were routine. Smoke curled upward, and from that smoke, aircraft still launched. That image, a carrier struck yet unbroken, captured the essence of why Japanese pilots came to fear the British. They had faced the unthinkable, an enemy that accepted their sacrifice, absorbed it, and simply carried on. The myth of the invincible kamikaze had met the immovable fortress. By June 1945, with Okinawa secured and Japan's skies emptied, the British Pacific Fleet withdrew to Sydney to refit. Its carriers were scarred but alive. Every one of them. The Japanese Navy's air arm, by contrast, was gone. In the silence that followed, even Japanese officers acknowledged the truth, that the kamikaze campaign had achieved little but ruin. And among the stories whispered in surviving air bases, one theme lingered. The Americans burned. The British did not. That sentence, part observation, part lament, became the unspoken epitaph of the kamikazes' final months, and in that quiet, defeated recognition lay the heart of their fear. The smoke cleared, the guns fell silent, and the British Pacific Fleet sailed on, battered, proud, undefeated. But the story did not end there. The consequences of this endurance would echo through shipyards, doctrines, and design tables for decades to come. When the guns finally ceased over Okinawa, the sea itself seemed exhausted. From March to May 1945, the British Pacific Fleet had endured more than 30 kamikaze attacks and countless near misses. Yet when the smoke lifted, all 4 armored carriers, indomitable, indefatigable, formidable, and victorious, were still afloat, still operational, and still flying aircraft. Their damage reports read more like maintenance logs than battle records. Formidable, struck twice, deck repairs completed within hours. Indefatigable, minor structural damage, resumed flight ops same day. Victorious, 2 direct hits, no hangar penetration. Indomitable, bomb splinters and fires contained. The numbers told a story that words struggled to capture. Across the campaign, British losses amounted to fewer than 100 killed in action. A fraction of the casualties suffered by American carriers hit under similar circumstances, and not a single British carrier was forced to withdraw permanently from operations. The armored deck concept, once criticized as too heavy, too limiting, had proven itself beyond question. British engineers had traded flight capacity for survivability, and in the crucible of kamikaze warfare, that trade became priceless. For Vice Admiral Sir Philip Vian, the fleet's commander, the victory was as much moral as tactical. In his post-action report, he wrote with understated pride, "Our ships have endured what the enemy designed to destroy utterly. They have done so with courage, precision, and an efficiency that speaks for all." He knew the Japanese had watched. Reconnaissance photographs and intercepted transmissions showed how astonishment turned to resignation among enemy observers. In Japanese after-action documents recovered post-war, one analyst concluded, "These ships are not as others. They resist burning. It is difficult to destroy them with suicide attacks." The fear had become codified, recorded as data. Yet the British victory at sea was not only a triumph of design, it was a triumph of endurance. For weeks, the fleet had operated without proper rest or relief, maintaining tempo under constant threat. Aircraft were repaired in makeshift conditions. Deck crews slept in 2-hour rotations. Meals were rationed, and fresh water was scarce. But morale never broke. Journalist Leonard Mosley, embedded with the fleet, described the aftermath aboard Formidable. Her deck looked like the surface of the moon, pitted, scorched, gouged. But men walked across it with coffee mugs, laughing quietly. It was as if they had made peace with the fire. Such scenes left deep impressions on the Americans who served alongside them. Admiral Raymond Spruance later told the Admiralty that the Royal Navy's armored carriers had redefined endurance at sea. Even U.S. Navy engineers, initially skeptical of the armored deck philosophy, began taking notes. Reports from the Bureau of Ships acknowledged that British carriers sustained direct hits, with negligible loss of efficiency. The lesson was inescapable. Survivability was not an accessory. It was strategy. Meanwhile, Japanese survivors struggled to reconcile what they had witnessed. Captured diaries from kamikaze trainees at Kanoya and Miyazaki reflected growing despair. "We trained to strike and burn. But these ships do not burn. The enemy continues to fly even after we give our lives. It feels empty." For them, the British fleet's resilience shattered the very premise of the kamikaze, that death could buy victory. Against armored decks and unflinching crews, sacrifice lost its power. As the Okinawa campaign drew to its close, the U.S. Navy rotated much of its damaged fleet for repairs at Ulithi and Pearl Harbor. The British, though battered, stayed on station. Their carriers' scars became symbols, proof that endurance, not speed, could decide survival in modern naval warfare. But beyond the statistics and steel, something deeper lingered. A quiet, almost spiritual fatigue shared by friend and foe alike. For the Japanese, the divine wind had met an enemy it could not destroy. For the British, survival had come at the cost of endless vigilance, a kind of courage that felt more like stubbornness than glory. The lessons they carried home would shape navies for generations to come. When the British Pacific Fleet finally withdrew to Sydney in late June 1945, the ships looked like survivors of a great trial. Decks dented, paint blistered, scars still visible where steel had met fire. Yet beneath the damage lay pride. Every carrier had come back under her own power. The dockyards in Australia were filled with welders, engineers, and naval architects eager to study the results. For years, the Royal Navy's armored deck doctrine had been controversial, even inside the Admiralty. American officers had argued that Britain's carriers sacrificed too much air power for protection, that wars were won by the number of planes a ship could launch, not by how long it could endure. Okinawa proved them wrong. Reports compiled by the British Pacific Fleet's Damage Control Department became essential reading in both London and Washington. They detailed in precise measurements the depth of craters, the rate of deck repair, and the spread of heat through armored plating. Engineers concluded that the armor had not only prevented penetration, but also acted as a heat sink, dissipating the inferno that would have ignited hangar fires. In practical terms, it meant survival, and survival meant continued combat power, something Japan could no longer match. Within months, the Admiralty commissioned post-war studies that would influence the next generation of carrier design. The Audacious class and Malta-class blueprints incorporated thicker decks, improved firefighting systems, and larger lifts to offset the limitations of enclosed hangars. Across the Atlantic, American designers quietly began re-evaluating their own approach. By 1949, the U.S. Navy's Midway-class carriers featured armored flight decks inspired directly by the Royal Navy's wartime experience. Even later supercarriers Forrestal, Enterprise, Nimitz carried traces of British thinking in their DNA, a recognition that endurance at sea mattered as much as striking power. The British Pacific Fleet's ordeal had rewritten the logic of naval survival, but the consequences extended beyond steel and doctrine. They reached into the psychology of warfare itself. For the Japanese, the kamikaze campaign's failure represented not just strategic defeat, but spiritual collapse. The divine wind, once a symbol of divine protection, had turned into a symbol of futility. The more they struck, the less they achieved. In the post-war years, surviving Japanese officers reflected bitterly on that revelation. Admiral Matome Ugaki, who had overseen the final kamikaze operations, wrote before his own suicide flight on August 15, 1945. "We believed death could be a weapon, but we found the enemy could endure beyond it." In that endurance lay the quiet victory of the British fleet. They had not sought glory. They had not claimed great battles or sunk enemy armadas. They had simply survived. And in doing so, they had broken the psychological weapon that Japan had built its final hope upon. The Royal Navy's actions at Okinawa were soon overshadowed by larger headlines: Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the surrender. Yet among naval historians, the campaign became a case study in design philosophy, vindicated by fire. In later decades, analysts would argue about the trade-offs: the slower sortie rates, the smaller air wings, but none could deny the results. The phrase armored carrier would become synonymous with survival itself. And though the British Pacific Fleet faded from public memory in the shadow of America's vast Pacific victories, its quiet endurance had left a legacy that outlived empires. By the time the war ended, the young Japanese pilots who had once feared nothing had learned their final lesson. That courage, when met by preparation and discipline, was not enough to change the tide. In the end, the armored carriers had done more than resist destruction. They had proven that technology, when shaped by experience and humility, could outlast even the most desperate human faith and sacrifice. The world moved on. The fleets demobilized, but those who had seen it would never forget the sight. British ships, wreathed in smoke, still launching aircraft. Proof that endurance, not destruction, had the last word. The fires had died, but their lessons glowed in every warship that followed. Now only one question remained. What did it all mean? For men, for machines, and for the future of warfare itself. The war ended, but the memory of those steel decks never did. For the British sailors who had stood beneath the falling sun of Okinawa, survival became its own quiet form of victory. They had not fought for glory, nor to prove superiority, only to endure. Yet in doing so, they had rewritten the psychology of air-sea warfare. The Japanese pilots had come believing that death itself was a weapon. They left believing that survival was stronger. There was something profoundly human in that revelation. That technology alone did not decide fate, but the spirit with which it was wielded. The British carriers were machines of war, yes, but they were also monuments to preparation, discipline, and the refusal to yield. Every hose drill, every armored bulkhead, every calm voice over a damage control circuit was an act of quiet defiance against chaos. Their endurance did more than save ships. It unmade a myth. It showed that the divine wind, the kamikaze, could be met not with desperation, but with design. When the fires were out and the last echoes faded from the Pacific, the British Pacific Fleet sailed home bearing more than scars. They carried proof that courage could take many forms. Not only the courage to die, but the rarer, harder courage to survive, to repair, and to carry on when everything around was burning. In the cold mathematics of war, endurance is easy to overlook. But in the gray light that followed 1945, endurance was the measure by which both sides were judged. The Japanese pilots, driven by faith, met an enemy that embodied patience. And in that meeting, something shifted. From the age of sacrifice to the age of systems, from burning decks to armored resolve. In the silence after the storm, one truth remained as enduring as the ships themselves. Fear does not belong to the reckless. It belongs to those who discover that their enemy can outlast death. And that is why, when the young men of Japan spoke in hushed tones of their final battles, they did not speak of the mighty Essex class, nor of the vast American armadas. They spoke of the British carriers, the ships that would not die. If this story moved you, if the endurance of those ships, and the men who kept them alive, gave you a new way to see courage, then help this history live on. Subscribe for more true, cinematic World War II documentaries. Every ship, every battle, every forgotten act of defiance told through real history. Like this video if you believe endurance deserves to be remembered as much as victory. Comment below. Which moment of the British Pacific Fleet story surprised you most? And share this film, so others can understand why, in the last days of the war, Japanese pilots feared not numbers or power, but resilience. Because history isn't just about who won, it's about who refused to sink.